Hello, everyone. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. We're excited to bring you another in our series of interviews with top leaders in health IT. And our guest today is Mike Cordeiro. He's Director, Interoperability, Market, and Product Strategy at Meditech. And Paul Wilder, Executive Director of Commonwealth Health Alliance. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so excited for this discussion. There's a lot happening with interoperability. I don't know, is it the golden age of interoperability? Maybe, but Paul, why don't you tell us a little bit about Commonwealth and also your relationship with the EHR vendors?
First of all, you mentioned the golden age of interop, kind of in the platinum or diamond age, I think here now.
Oh, okay.
Last decade was gold. So, Commonwealth formed 2013, a bunch of like-minded, predominantly EHR as their focus, but really HIT developers that said interoperability is important for our customers, their patients, and for us. And we don't think we can do it alone. Making a system that interoperates between ourselves doesn't quite meet the need of the way patients work, which is going in between care settings, between different hospitals, primary care, specialty, go down the list, and that could be in and out of different vendors. So it creates a community of like-minded people trying to solve problems and create solutions for those. And we like to think of it as always trying to raise the bar. Instead of thinking of a lowest common denominator to make this work, what's the next thing we're going to do just past that or even further past that to really make interoperability work to get to where we are today, which is, leaps and bounds where we were from 2013 to today.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, what would you add? What's Meditech's perspective on why you're working with Commonwealth?
Yeah, I would echo what Paul said in that, it's a bunch of like-minded folks trying to achieve a common goal, which is essentially to improve the patient experience by ensuring that their health records follow them wherever they receive treatment. And as an end result, clinicians have the data they need to make the best decisions possible. And we've been Commonwealth implementers since 2017. And since that time, we've expanded our role within the community. We have a number of folks that sit on various Commonwealth work streams and committees, chair those. We're proponents of evolving technology through the network and participate in a number of various showcases, just displaying the power of the network and how we're evolving from a technology standpoint.
Interesting. So Paul, I'd love to hear, how is Commonwealth really able to bring together these multiple vendor voices? To me, that kind of sounds like herding cats, right? To help drive decisions, how does that work? How has that impacted, your approach and your success with Commonwealth?
Yeah, so it starts from the membership discussion, right? We talk to HIT developers, and we have a pretty, I wouldn't say aggressive, it's a friendly conversation about this is what we're expecting. We're expecting that you're here because you find a need for your customers to interoperate, not as a check the box, joining something to look supportive. And don't get me wrong, we have many members that aren't directly attached to our service platform that do support us, right? That want to participate in the discussion. Most of them are interoperability gurus in the making. They need to participate in the community to kind of figure out the last bits before they connect to the service platform. So it starts out with setting the stage of what this fraternity or community, what we're here for, and going from there. We have all these committees. It is governed by the vendors themselves. So we have marketing committees and standards development and the like. It's a really safe vendor neutral space to get this work done. And don't get me wrong, there's some great work done outside of Commonwealth by others, but I think we are accelerating each other. There's a little bit of almost like internal competitive juice to have the best idea. When you have the best idea that you're willing to share it, that's really powerful. It's almost like open sourcing interoperability in a practical way, right? Like it needs to be not something that anybody in their garage takes advantage of, but experts take advantage of, and they're sharing with each other every day to make their stuff work better with each other.
Yeah, I've seen this a lot with direct trust and the consensus building that's required. I think, it creates a great outcome, but it takes longer to achieve. Is that kind of your experience with this? Is that by having multiple EHR vendors, it takes longer maybe to achieve a result, but then it has longer term impact? Is that how you see it, Paul, or what do you think?
Well, it's actually an interesting question because I can't answer it because we don't have the yin yang here to evaluate what would have happened if we just had, if I just worked at Meditech doing this work, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
I do think though, if you kind of game theory it through, it just wouldn't work as well, right? It wouldn't serve the need of, my closest facility, hospital right there, a Meditech facility, one across the street, a couple miles away, CERN, or another one 5 miles away. Like it keeps changing. And I have patient portals and bills from all of them, right? So you can see where there's natural fragmentation that is in no way my fault as a patient. Like take my job as executive director or Mike's job away. At some point, we're all patients. We're all consumers of healthcare. And you go to what's best for your care, both from what what your specialists and your primary care providers guide you towards. The last question you're asking is, what EHR do you have, right? Now I do it because I'm a geek in this industry and I just want to know, like, hey, what do you work with? I got CERN, I got Meditech. It's like, yeah, it's good to know. Just because then I can have a conversation when it doesn't work right, if it's one that's not in Commonwealth, to tell them what to tell their vendors. But you got to be where the patient is, not forcing them into a model or a geography. Even geographically, we have to be careful. Commonwealth was national from the beginning. And if you go back, and John, you can do this if you really want to, you'll find interviews of me in 2013 when I was at a regional HIE saying, what about this Commonwealth thing? And I was like, I think it's very complimentary because the boundaries of HIEs aren't understood by patients, right? They don't know that when I cross over the Hudson River, which is about a half mile to my left, that I've just hit an entirely different consent and policy world for health policy because I went from New Jersey to New York. And the original critique was there's no way you could do this national because the rules are so different. And we said, healthcare is local, and I get that. 95% of your healthcare is probably near your house, blah, 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 blah. The 5% might really matter, right? And if you get everything connected, the national is local and local is national. There's no distinguishing when it's all connected. So how about we just strive to connect it all? And the reality is, if you go to the original founders in the first year, didn't work so well, right? You had 100 things connected. They're all over the place. They don't have overlap of catchment areas. Doesn't work. So they were kind of investing in the next wave to come and said, we'll join anyway, right? Because we believe the story is right. And when it gets to 1,000 and 10,000 and now 27,000 sites, oh, this thing is working, right? The likelihood of clicking the button in any of our members' applications by a provider and getting no data is nearly zero, right? Wow. In the beginning, that was nearly 100%, right? Because the overlaps weren't there. You had to get it moving. The network effect works if the network is connected.
Interesting. Mike, what would you add? What's it been like working kind of collectively with vendors?
No, I think that's like Paul kind of hit the nail on the head there. It is a group of folks with a common goal in collaborating to solve a problem, right? The power of it is we're collectively defining standards, defining implementation guides, and now that we're all working under the same rules of engagement, we're facilitating exchange and increasing adoption. And that's essentially the power of just interoperating within the network and having that trust relationship with entities in that environment, right?
Yeah, I think, John, if you don't, just one little bit, I think it's worth, there are a lot of entities that do this stuff regionally and some nationally. And we are a nonprofit, Meditech, of course, is a for-profit, and so are most of our members. And it's in our DNA because we are a nonprofit trade alliance. We're not a nonprofit educational, we're not going out there proselytizing. It's practical, right? My members, vendors, and producers of technology have a need and need a space to have this discussion to figure out what to do. And just for anybody listening, the most common example I use is like Bluetooth, right? You think of all these devices that connect to each other. That's a trade alliance too. And you have Microsoft and Google, all these companies that are directly competitors fighting it out every day, but they need a safe space to be able to figure out how to make their headphones attached to a laptop and vice versa to rise all ships, right? To make this work. And there could be proprietary stuff that works a little better sometimes from one vendor versus another. but the baseline technology has to work, or you don't establish trust in the idea of disconnecting the cables to then get to the innovation to make those cableless things work even better. And so that's what makes this a little bit, actually a lot different from most of the other efforts out there, which are a theory in public health or something, some baseline. This is vendors who have a need to solve a problem to the benefit of patients in the end. So it's a good service, but it'd also be a lot harder to do if they didn't have help.
Yeah, great example. So Paul, the big interoperability word right now is TEFCA, right? Everyone's talking about TEFCA and the new word QHIN, right? So talk to us about how is Commonwealth approaching TEFCA? Are you going to be apply to be a QHIN?
Yep.
And really, how will the EHR companies that are part of the alliance benefit from this? Should they be creating their own QHIN? Maybe Mike can hop in there. How Meditech's planning to do it? Talk to us about TEFCA and QHINs.
Yeah, I mean, TEFCA is a big deal for us. And if you actually look at the structure of TEFCA, the way it was designed, it's kind of the Commonwealth playbook amplified to the next level, right? So we're a network of networks. You can consider all of our members, and this may not be known by the average person. We have one connection to Meditech. I have one connection to the next member, and they have their connections to their customers underneath. So it's a very efficient model from a Commonwealth perspective. We have 36 connections to handle about 130 million documents a month and 171 million people registered, 27,000 sites. It grows big from that 36 connections. But just like we needed more members and vendors to cooperate and get here, we recognize we're not the only network, right? And it's better for our members if we interoperate at the edge of ourselves better to those other networks who may have different standards for their membership and how they connect stuff. So TEFCA kind of says, make an Uber Commonwealth above Commonwealth, and let's connect all that stuff together. So it aligns perfectly with, now, truth be known, if in 2014, all those who are in those networks joined us, we probably have this problem solved already. And that'd have been nice, but this is the best alternative to that. And it's just like you can't have Verizon being the only mobile provider. There's actually a problem with general monopoly type behavior, right? It's good to have some competition, even at the edge of a thing like this, which is trying to convene other things together. So it's taking our model and boom, bopping it up to the rest of the industry. We were happy to have them join in the first place, but this is the best alternative to that, to move the ball, to get that ball rolling again, because patients don't know those boundaries. They don't know that Meditech is not in that other network, and they shouldn't have to ever have to figure that out.
Yeah, and patients don't care. So it sounds like you will become a QHIN. Is that right?
Yep, that's a straight question. Yeah, it's funny, we haven't made a major announcement about it because we always assumed that everybody knew that's the case. We expect to announce the second our application is put in, because that to us is actual news. But it's too much like us to not be involved. We have to be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been funny, some of the announcements, some of the verbiage of, are you applying to be a QHIN versus I am a QHIN. So that makes sense why you're careful with it. Because I think some people get that confused, right? So that's interesting. Mike, how is Meditech kind of approaching TEFCA?
Yeah, well, in TEFCA is the next chapter for interoperability. Like Paul said, it's the opportunity to promote wider adoption of data exchange through multiple networks, and essentially bridging any gaps that exist between networks. So we're fully supportive of TEFCA and committed to see this next chapter be successful. And we're continuing to work with Commonwealth in advancing data exchange through the network.
Yeah, it seems like one of the major goals of TEFCA is kind of, reaching a state of vendor neutrality, if you will, that you can basically just exchange with everyone. I mean, to Paul's point, right? Like that is the goal. The patient doesn't care. They just want the data shared. I mean, they care to a certain extent, privacy, et cetera, but they really just want the right data at the right place at the right time. So, maybe Paul, you could chime in first. How do you see Commonwealth really contributing towards this goal?
Yeah, first of all, we have experience at scale. We have, I think, 171 million people registered, which is a lot. Basically, half the population and even a higher percentage of the adult population, which a lot of interop actually is focused on.
Sure.
We could probably a whole nother podcast in a couple months about where we're moving the ball in pediatrics and part 2 data and a whole bunch of other things we want to solve after this.
Yeah.
But we need to finish laying these pipes.
It has lots of privacy issues too, but it is its own discussion.
It's also harder to verify people that don't have a history of things that are verifiable, right? They don't have contracts or credit cards or things that prove that they actually exist yet. So it's harder to do some of the security and privacy stuff. But no, here's the basic story, right? So there's no boundaries between where I seek my care. I go where I need to go, or where my payer is going to pay for my stuff, unless I want to pay it out of my pocket. And those boundaries already exist. We don't want boundaries in the vendor search. And what Tefka was designed to be was a single on-ramp to the entire system, to everything connected, right? It's, all the interstate highways need to be connected together so you can get from Los Angeles to Orlando somehow. And we think that's critical. If you take an example, I talked about like the health is mostly local. We're doing some geo searching and other weird things in care quality to try and find data. Like I'm looking for data for Paul Wilder. He lives in New Jersey. Let's try and hit all the practices in New Jersey and a couple in New York and see if they have data for him. It's phishing. It's not very accurate. And the reality is, if I had a major issue, let's say I had a unique form of cancer, and even with the great facilities in New York City, 3 miles from my house, they're not the specialists in that. It actually turns out it's Seattle General, right? And I find it worth my time to get on a plane 3,000 miles, 6.5 hours a pop, 4 times a month, because it's that important to me. That data shouldn't be dark to my providers in the New York area, nor to my provider out in Seattle, just because we're using geofence heuristics. That last bit of data, that 1, 3, 5%, might be the most important piece of data. And creating an on-ramp of the entire nation says that that's true. Like, I don't know the utility of one piece of data versus another. Get it in front of the clinician and let them decide. Don't let the computers decide. And right now we do have some of that going on, where because the compute power to query the whole country is inefficient, we don't do it. In our world, we have an RLS that's doing all this matching. It's a lot of upfront work to make this work, but at the point of care, when the provider hits the button, it's very fast. They don't notice all the other stuff that happened. And we think that's important at a national scale, that it's one button, one click, and it's seconds, not hours and days. You're in ED bed nearly dying because you can't breathe. Hours doesn't work, right? So we need to keep that in mind.
Will the QHINs and Tefka help to solve that? I mean, that seems like it is a massive problem, is locating the patient records, right? Wherever they are, and knowing, and I would say that's the difference between this and, your Bluetooth example, which is, you want to get all the records, and, whereas in Bluetooth, you just have to connect 2 points, right? Like a little easier than, oh, do I have all 40 records across 40 organizations that I need? And so, does the QHINs and Tefka help us to solve kind of locating the patient records? And how do you see that kind of playing out? Commonwealth, it sounds like, is working on solving that problem. Will QHINs and Tefka help that problem, or will it just be like another place to fish?
Well, this is actually, I'll tell you, this is the primary reason why we want to be part of the first set of QHINs, to make sure that the original vision of Tefka doesn't get lost in the noise of us all trying to figure out how to build this stuff. The theory of Tefka is that the QHINs, the major backbone providers, like think of Verizon and AT&T as cellular backbone providers, and think of consumer cellular, which is a brand that you can buy that rents towers from AT&T and Verizon to cover a network. You don't have to build the towers to have a product, right? So the QHINs are the backbone, and they have participants behind them, then they have end users, et cetera. So we want that single on-ramp, but the QHIN, by theory of Tefka, is supposed to be aware of the locations, or able to find all the locations of data for a given patient queried into its community. So another QHIN comes to Commonwealth and says, where's Paul Wilder's data? And we say, here are the 4 locations we know of like that, right? Which is what we do today for our members, right? It's actually forcing us to put our internal functionality at the edge, but we're thrilled to do it because it's important that they have that functionality too. And just for full transparency, there is a little bit in the QTF, which is the QHIN technical framework. It's a technical document of TEFCA that indicates there's some squishiness on whether you're responsible for responding for your entire community or whether you can limit your search for computational efficiency. And quite frankly, we want to make sure that that squishiness is hard, right? Because the promise doesn't work if we can't do the query that I described, which is one on-ramp to every provider and patient record across the country for everything participating, right? We know it's going to take time to get everybody participating, probably going to take a couple of years because we have care quality, we have CommonWell, we need to do some convergence and disconnect some things and reconnect. That's not an overnight process. But at the end of that, let's say 3 years, let's call it 3 years. That's the theory. If I see a list of who's participating, if I have data on those, I better be able to find it. And then we can argue about, the national identifier things and making it easier to do the matching, but let's not make it hard to find the locations at all, right? That's a primary tenet of TEFCA that we want to make sure stays in place.
Interesting. Mike, what would you add to this? I think locating the patient records is important, but what are some of the use cases that you think are going to benefit patients and, Meditech users?
Well, having the power of an RLS, where data exists, who registered data for a patient, right? So right now we're talking about sharing structured documents to the network for the purposes of treatment, which is important, but having a record locator service that denotes where data is available allows you to scale up and modernize your approach to requesting information. So instead of pulling in or pulling in structured documents and parsing those documents for specific pieces of data, maybe we can go out through the network and query for discrete data and have a clinician be able to ask for a patient's HbA1c values and trend them over time, as opposed to having to pull them out of pulling them out of documents, right? So I think the power of the RLS allows for us to modernize our approach to sharing data and advancing the technology needle forward even more.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's absolutely right. It also just a little extra context. We have a lot of clinical flows that are quasi-administrative. That if right now the data you get from care quality and other networks in and out, it's treated as reference, right? It's hard to rely on it if you don't know if it's complete, right?
Yeah.
And so every provider is doing a history and physical. They've never met you before. They're doing a background. They're reconciling against all this stuff, but they don't look at this data blob and say, okay, here are the clinical administrative / steps I should be able to skip or offload to a different process, like the tablet in the waiting room. You go through and check off the things you know. So when you come in the room, we have an efficient encounter because I've never met you before, but my application and myself, I'm aware of what to start working on, right? So if you want to bend the quality cost curve, better data and more efficient encounters yields better health while not costing us anymore. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Also on the patient access side, we're trying to make one on-ramp we're talking all these provider use cases, but we want to also be able to plug consumer applications in here so that I can get a complete history of my stuff without having to dig through calling every provider I've ever seen and remembering who they are. It's actually really hard to know who they were and whether they're relevant today, right? Which ones should I exclude or which ones I should really go after? And until you have a catastrophic problem, you tend not to even think about that.
Yeah.
So it's unfair.
Let alone your portal password. So
That's so many.
Someone said hyperportalosis. That's the diagnosis. No, it's a good point from the patient perspective for sure. Mike, as we wrap up, where do you envision kind of interoperability advancing in the future? And maybe what are some things holding the industry back that you'd love to see improved or solved?
I think that from an interoperability standpoint, we're all talking about it. We're all saying that we're sharing data. I think that our next step in how we move forward is actually applying it, right? And actually showing the value to the health systems, to the patients, to the clinicians, so that they further promote and want to use technology to better outcomes and increase efficiencies.
Yeah, I avoided that question for Paul. Do people really want to lower costs? But Paul, what would you add as far as where interoperability is advancing?
Well, I'm surprised actually Mike didn't say this, because Meditech is a really strong proponent of moving towards FHIR. And you mentioned a little before about discrete data. TEFCA, interestingly, along with this conversation, has a FHIR roadmap embedded in it. It's a very loose roadmap right now, but we do need some things we need to refactor. Refactoring is getting away from geofence and geosearching over towards complete. And then I think the next thing is about allowing systems to work with discrete data for their flows to be faster. Documents have worked great. And actually, Meditech was the one who pushed us into doing FHIR-based documents that exchange between IHE and the older stacks that we do seamlessly. So our broker communicates in both. We've been doing FHIR forever. And well, since Meditech made us about 5 years ago. And almost every new member that shows up to Commonwealth today uses the FHIR binary document resource stuff instead of the older style spec stuff we have, which is an interesting point. And that's not discrete data. It's the big blobs. It's the, I need to know your salary, so you send me your entire tax return to get line one, right? That's an inefficient way to get that one piece of data. And FHIR in being in the TEFCA roadmap is interesting in that, one, we set up the rules of the road, the trust, the general contractual structure, and the philosophy of an on-ramp to everything. And then we can make that next thing more efficient too, which is good for the EHR. It's good for a whole universe of apps who do not exist today. And it's really good for consumer applications, which are more driven by mobile devices and the like, which are using RESTful services that require more efficiency. So I think it's a double leapfrog coming here very rapidly. You look at the ONC roadmap, we're looking at a 2-year twist to get a lot of stuff done. And interestingly enough, everybody's really excited to do it as opposed to really scared about it. That's good.
Well, it's really just about exchanging data in a modern, scalable, efficient manner, and then being able to expand their use cases, right? And get to, like we're saying, sharing data discreetly via FHIR through the network, and not rely on, a review of large documents to get to specific points during the treatment process. So 100%, it's really about advancing technology and being more efficient.
And ultimately impacting patients and providers. That's I think the message here. So thanks so much, Mike. Thanks so much, Paul, for sharing these insights and perspectives. I think gave us a good insight into Commonwealth's view, and obviously working with EHR vendors like Meditech and obviously the coming Tefka QHIN that's going to impact all of us, I think, in healthcare IT. So thanks so much, guys, and thanks everyone for watching and listening. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com or search for Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcasting application. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.